Malayan jungle, as wild and as dangerous as the animals that live in it. Bringing these animals back alive is my business, and the jungle is my office. The only way to reach the real interior of the jungle is on the back of an elephant. These hardy beasts can carry over 500 pounds, but they're hardly what you'd call speedy. Our caravan only averages about 2 miles an hour, and I was anxious to get to work. From zoos back in America, I had orders to capture alive and deliver alive practically every type of animal that lived in the jungle. I've made many of these trips out of Singapore into the steaming depths of the backcountry, and each time I've been just as impatient to get off the trail and go to work. But an Indian elephant is not a Times Square taxi, and I've been out here too long to expect to hurry the east. We still had a long way to go from our camp, where I had sent the boys on ahead. But you can only go so far by elephant in Malay country. From here on, the jungle gets so thick that working these big fellows would be just a series of engineering problems. So we unloaded our elephants and prepared to carry the supplies the rest of the way on foot. Food, tools, and medicine are the white man's only protection against the jungle. And I knew that I couldn't call up a corner drugstore for cartridges and quinine if I needed them. Fever and tigers don't wait. So everything I might require went with me on that long trek into the heart of the animal country. Here I was, back in the Malayan jungle, the place that I had cursed 1,000 times, but the only place where I really felt at home. I don't know why, for it's not the most comfortable spot on earth. It's 110 in the shade and almost twice that hot in the sun. The dense, damp undergrowth keeps out the fresh air, so that the humidity intensifies the heat. There are thousands of insect pests, and all the water must be boiled to kill the 17 kinds of fever germs. And yet, to me, it's one of the most beautiful and restful spots on the face of the earth. But beside the beauty and the solitude, the jungle has other fascinations. All about me were signs of menace and lurked constantly in the underbrush. Danger that creeps and death that crawls. I'd left man's laws a few miles outside of Singapore. Out here was only the law of fang and claw, the grim code of the survival of the fittest. Not all the creatures are deadly, but they're all on my list. And whatever happened, I was out to bring them back alive. When we arrived at the campsite, I found construction well underway. My native boys had built the framework of our shelter without using any nails. They simply tied beams and poles together with strips of rattan. We had plenty of water, and with the tools I had brought with me, it was no time at all before we had the camp completely finished and ready. It wasn't the Waldorf Astoria, but there's no place like home. But I had a job to do. All around me, the jungle was a teeming menagerie of wildlife. So I thought I'd make an inspection trip, just to see what the place had to offer. I never left camp without being well armed. A white man is nature's most helpless animal. And though my business is capturing, not killing, I've seen what is left of people who put too much trust in the jungle. Ollie, my Malay #1 boy, had been with me for years. We've taken turns at saving each other's life. I'd sooner walk through the jungle blindfolded than without Ollie. We hadn't gone far before we started seeing some of the creatures I had traveled thousands of miles to get. We noticed the rare proboscis monkey, the Jimmy Durante of the jungle. None of these long-nosed, short-tempered simians had ever been seen in a zoo, so I put this one down for future business. Going on a little further, we started a black Siamang gibbon, another fellow I determined to get before I left the jungle. We noticed that there was a certain tenseness in the air. The animals all seemed uneasy, afraid. They seemed to be making for cover. as though some unknown danger was approaching. Then we saw the reason. A huge tiger, with more stripes than a top sergeant and twice as mean, was out looking for lunch. So was this black leopard. We saw the tiger creep up, and suddenly pounce on the leopard from behind. Well, it looks like the jungle cat fight was a draw. So the boys separate and go out looking for a meal that won't fight back. The leopard got off easy in that mix-up, but danger works 24 hours a day in the jungle. And a python like this can crush a man into the shape of a sausage in 3 minutes, unhinge his jaws and swallow him. He's got an appetite as long as his stomach. And I knew the black leopard hadn't any idea of his presence. If he had, he'd have been heading the other way. It's all over now. That python sure did a quick job on the leopard. He was a beautiful specimen. So I'd sent Ollie back for a cage and some equipment. I wanted him for my first shipment, and I was going to get him if I had to tie him into a bowknot to do it. He had to uncoil himself from the dead leopard before he could devour his hard-earned prey. But by then, he had seen us, and a python knows instinctively that he has no friends. I decided to catch him cowboy style, the way I used to lasso rattlers with a string when I was a kid down in Texas. We ran one end of the rope, through the cage, and out the back. Then it was a simple matter to drop the noose over his head. It wasn't so simple, however, to pull him in. These great reptiles have the strength of several men in a tug of war. I knew that if he ever anchored himself with those teeth, the deadly coils would whip around me like the lash of a bullwhip. I knew that if I wanted to keep my original shape, I'd better keep his head under control. Now, he took a vicious swipe at Ollie that time, so I did the same thing to him. He was pretty well tuckered out by now, but there was enough meanness left in him to make up for it. We finally put more than 25 feet of python where it would do no more harm. He's in the zoo in Chicago now, where his meal times are more regular, but not so exciting. After a few weeks at our headquarters camp, my Malay boys and I decided to go after a giant orangutan. These big fellows are found in the island of Sumatra, southwest of the Malay Peninsula. But our trip over there was well worthwhile, for we soon located this fine specimen. He was a monstrous brute, the nearest thing to a gorilla I had ever seen in the Asiatic forests. I determined to capture him if I had to follow him from tree to tree, the whole length of Sumatra. And he was just as determined that that's what I'd have to do before I got him. After leading us in circles around the jungle, he stopped to catch his breath in a nest that he'd built high up in a huge tree. His treetop penthouse was way out of our reach, so I had Ollie knock at his front door. I thought maybe his curiosity would bring him down lower. He didn't look a bit interested, only annoyed. I could see these tactics weren't getting us anywhere. The orang was over 150 feet up in the tree, and with night coming on, I knew he'd be gone by morning. I'd sent the boys back to the village for a stout rope net, which I placed next to the tree. Then I prepared to shoot the branch right out from under the big ape. Just as I broke the branch, he leaped out to safety, and we had to follow him with our net. And he did a Tarzan act through the treetops. Every time I'd shoot one branch from under him, he'd swing to another. Finally, he really lost his temper. I was throwing lead up at him, so he started throwing things down at me. He was tearing that tree limb from limb, and he wanted to do the same thing to me. I could see that all our strategy had failed. So I let him stew up there while I retired to pick up a new attack. We finally built a huge cage with some planks and iron bars we'd brought along, and camouflaged it with shrubbery. If he lacked curiosity, he at least had an appetite. So I baited the cage with a luscious durian fruit attached to a release cord. I was going to let this wise guy capture himself. I probably would never have gotten my giant orang if it weren't for the durian. I've always found this strange fruit indispensable as bait, for it is eaten by every animal in the jungle, even those who ordinarily eat only meat. I've eaten it myself many times. It's very delicious once you get used to the smell, and it smells awful, like a rotten onion. But the pulp tastes like cream cheese with a dash of sherry and almond. It's the one common article of diet in the Malay archipelago. But when I got my orangutan back to camp on the mainland, he wasn't interested in durian. He'd rather have eaten the right hand of friendship that I offered him. He sure was a sore loser. Zoologically speaking, he was a beautiful specimen. From many other standpoints of beauty, he was a fur-bearing hangover, and his disposition matched his face. He was strong enough and mean enough to pull my arm from its socket if he could get a firm grip. I gathered that he didn't like me. But the last time I saw him, a few years ago in the St. Louis Zoo, he seemed quite content to be away from the kill or be killed routine of the jungle. One day while I was away from camp, a couple of the boys thought they'd conduct an expedition of their own. They were certain they saw tigers under every tree and pythons under every bush. But their most terrifying assailant turned out to be a little honey bear cub that had wandered away from the den and gotten lost. He didn't know it, but the boys had saved his life. Every jaw in the jungle has an appetite behind it. And a helpless little fellow like this has blue plate dinner written all over him. Full grown, these pygmy bears weigh only about 100 pounds, but they're meaner than a mattress of fish hooks. But as cubs, they're great pets, and this one was a long way from the dangerous age. The boys knew that I'd be overjoyed to get a honey bear without having to scour the country. One thing about our camp, located as it was in the heart of the jungle, we didn't always have to go far out of our way to get our animals. Sometimes they saved us the trouble by coming to us. On one occasion, I heard a terrific racket outside the camp. I looked up and saw a troop of golden gibbons were holding midday maneuvers in the nearby trees. Here was a great chance for me. I'd wanted to get some of these rare gibbons for a long time, and the impudent little beggars were daring me to do it. I planned on hanging a trap high up in this big durian tree, and the climbing ability of my native boy was worthy of even a gibbon's admiration. In all our preparations, I made no attempt at secrecy. In fact, I made as much fuss as possible to attract the gibbon's attention. These little apes are 1/4 monkey and 3/4 curiosity, and I knew that as soon as I'd left the trap, they'd send a delegation over to investigate it. We baited the trap with bananas, but we could have used an old rubber boot just as well, for these gibbons were just bursting with curiosity. One smart little fellow thought he'd figured out the combination. He tried to deal his dinner from the bottom of the deck, but that only got him half rations. So he went around to the front door. They say that curiosity can kill a cat. Well, it can also catch a gibbon. Goldie, as we call this one, soon became accustomed to captivity and became the pet of the camp. One day I heard a grim story concerning a nearby plantation. It seems that a huge tiger had killed one of the coolie boys and turned man-eater. No one was safe, and the entire neighborhood was in terror. The tiger is the only criminal born with stripes, and he's a killer at heart. The natives were just as anxious to get him off the plantation as I was to get him into a cage. So we made a trip up to the place where the killer had last been seen. He had jumped this fence, so I ordered the boys to saw a square hole in it, just above the ground. I was sure he'd follow the line of least resistance and jump through that hole. In the meantime, we started excavation on a deep pit at just the spot where we expected him to land. We had some difficulty with that pit. Heavy rains had made the earth as mushy as oatmeal, and the bottom was always full of seepage. It was a lot of trouble at the time, but we were grateful for it later on. When the pit was finally completed, we covered it over with a camouflage of green bamboo shoots. We were quite confident that we'd capture the killer because man-eating tigers follow the old rule of the jungle world. They always return to the scene of their crime. We had to wait 3 long days, however, before he finally came back. It was early in the morning, and he was hungry. The hole was a convenience he hadn't counted on, but it was too high for him to crawl through, so he had to jump. We took our crude equipment out to the trap at once. The minute we got there, I realized that we hadn't made the pit deep enough. The only thing that kept Mr. Stripes from climbing out was the water that had seeped in. It had made the pit slippery, and the enraged animal couldn't get a foothold for a good spring. But it's one thing to get a tiger into a hole, and another to get him out again. The earth around the edge of the pit was so slippery that I was afraid any minute one of us would fall in. So before we went any further, I decided we'd better throw a few ropes around our prisoner. He was working himself up into a perfect frenzy of rage and hate, putting on a brave show, just like any other cornered criminal. Trussed up as well as we could, but I knew that we'd never get him out, just working from above. Somebody would have to go down into the pit and guide the tiger into the box, for only when he was safely caged would I let him be brought to the surface. I was taking no chances. This heavy box, open end up, into the pit. I can tell you, I'd rather have taken a dive into a barrel of broken glass than go down that ladder, but somebody had to do it. I'd tried to close the tiger's jaws with a wooden peg, but it had come undone, and his vicious clawed feet were held together by just a few slip nooses. I got the box under the tiger all right, and the boys lowered him in. I tell you, I was relieved with that fellow safely stowed away. I was sure glad to get out of that pit. We rigged our tackle up on a makeshift derrick and hauled our prize slowly to the surface. Well, here was one tiger whose homicidal days were done. The natives could once more be free to tap their rubber trees without constant fear of creeping death. As for the killer, It was a long term behind bars for him. He was committed to a zoo to serve a life term for murder. The commonest animals in the jungle are not always the easiest to catch. These rhesus monkeys are everywhere, but to put salt on their tails is as hard as putting lard on an eel. Monkeys are the most popular attraction at any zoo, and I always have a standing order for them. Any walk through the jungle offers 1,000 opportunities to capture them, and they always have 1,000 ways to keep from being captured. Catching them one by one would be a tiresome process, so I worked out a scheme for getting them in wholesale lots. We baited the trap with a regular 3-course dinner: chopped sweet potato, tapioca root, and rice. With a feed like that, we could have enticed the missing link, let alone a lot of hungry monkeys. After we'd baited the trap, we tied a line to each of the poles supporting the top of the frame and ran the lines back into the underbrush. From then on, it was a question of waiting until these monkeys got hungry enough to come down out of the trees. We had to wait over an hour for their hunger and curiosity to overcome their caution. When they did decide that everything was on the up and up, they simply swarmed over the net. Their manners weren't very good, but they were having as much fun as a barrel of people. When I was sure that we had all the guests we could accommodate at our free lunch table, I gave Ollie the signal to jerk the lines. When these monkeys finally found out that their free meal had a string to it, they were certainly excited. We were pretty excited too, for we had captured about 35 of them in one haul, enough to populate a complete monkey house in a zoo. It was a comparatively simple matter to get these chattering little imps into our cage and carry them back to camp. As a matter of fact, they soon had plenty of company, for at the end of the week, we'd gotten about 400 of them. And to make up for their first disappointment, the rest of their lives, all their meals would be on the house. One day, Ollie and I ran into this herd of elephants while we were out looking for a tiger that I knew to be in the neighborhood. I noticed that they were upset, nervous. I wondered what could be disturbing them, until I saw this little elephant calf. He had obviously wandered off from the herd and gotten lost. But the herd had gone off in the wrong direction, and if they didn't find him, something else certainly would. There was the tiger. The little elephant apparently sensed the tiger's presence too, because he was in a panic of fear. I decided I'd better get into this race too, for I wanted that baby elephant. And I was determined that one of these animals had to die. It would be the tiger and not the helpless youngster. As soon as the big cat dropped, I set on after the little fellow. Bulldogging a Texas steer is nothing compared with trying to get a half Nelson on an elephant. He gave me a workout, all right. The tiger was as dead as mutton, but I had an elephant alive and kicking. After we had him all tied up like a Christmas package, we had to furnish him transportation back to camp. Slung on 2 poles, it took 4 boys to carry him. He may have been only a baby, but he weighed over 300 pounds ringside. I was glad that I had had only a tiger to deal with to get this fellow. If any of his friends or relatives had been around, they might have decided that I rated their attention. In that case, I'd have been flattened and not flattered, for they weighed close to 4 tons each. But Junior wasn't filled with feathers either, and the boys were plumb tuckered out by the time they got him into camp. He was quite docile and friendly after he'd gotten his land legs, and everybody did their best to make him feel at home, including Goldie. But our elephant was only a few months old, and that meant he was going to get hungry any minute. I figured that a section of bamboo would make an excellent feeding bottle. I was an old hand at this nursemaid business, but it's easier to make a milk bottle in the jungle than it is to fill it. And my guest was letting me know in no uncertain terms that he was used to having his meals on time. I sent one of the boys over to the nearest native settlement to see if he could scare up something to fill an elephant. The local milkman had a silent partner who did all the work. He was a pigtail rhesus monkey, trained to climb up and pick coconuts. Insulated by a thick, fibrous shell, the coconut milk is kept cool and refreshing, as though it were in a picnic jug. If you're wise, you'd drink this in place of water in Malaya. You don't have to boil the malaria germs out of it, and it tastes swell. I mixed up a good feeding formula by adding the coconut milk to a bucket of boiled rice, and he went for that mess as if it were the first meal he'd ever had. I took such a liking to my 300-pound baby that I wouldn't have traded him for 10 tigers like the one I had to shoot. The jungle is not a bad place to work, except in spots, and most of those spots are on the leopard. This savage cat will eat anything that he can conquer, and conquer anything that can't defend itself. Ollie and I were on the trail of this fine-looking clouded leopard, an uncommon species that I wanted very much. But the top limbs of the tree are his normal element, and I was afraid I'd have as much trouble with him as I did with that giant orang. I sent Ollie back to camp for a net and some of the boys, while I kept the leopard treed. As soon as the net was ready, I started to shoot the branch out from under him. He was as nimble as that big orang, and I had to try again. There, he landed right in our laps, unharmed but plenty mad. All his cunning and treachery were no good to him now, and he knew it. Next to measles, he was about the meanest thing in spots I'd ever caught. But he measured 6 feet from tooth to tail, one of the finest specimens of clouded leopard that I'd ever seen in Malaya. Of all the creatures that live in the Asiatic jungle, the most appealing to me is the little mouse deer. Full grown, They stand only about 8 inches high, but they are regular members in good standing of the deer family. These little pygmies are perfectly harmless, and I always break up the traps the natives set to catch them. Their meat is considered a great delicacy, and this black leopard looked like she was trying to promote a free meal. I've caught a great many of my animals in the vicinity of these traps, but right now, I only had Ollie with me, and no nets or snares. I knew I'd have to let that leopard go, but I could still save the little mouse deer. When I approached the trap, the leopard ran off in the jungle. I knew as soon as I got to the trap that what that leopard had been after was not a mouse deer at all. Reaching in with a leather noose, I found I'd caught a pint-sized tornado. That black leopard had been after one of her own cubs that had gotten caught in the deer trap. He was a cute little fellow, but no better tempered than the rest of his breed. That leopard cub was an unexpected find, but he was as big as we could handle without equipment. So we didn't hang around, but continued our search for more mouse deer traps. We had hidden the leopard safe in a tree, so we could pick him up later. The jungle was beautiful that day. The jungle appeared to be full of those mouse deer traps. The natives seemed to build them as fast as I could break them. But I determined that these harmless little creatures wouldn't be molested as long as I could find the traps. After I released the deer, I started to tear the trap into kindling. Through his spinal column, he released his hold, and I shook the great monster loose. But I had to finish him off with a few more shots. I was sorry I had to shoot that python. He was a fine specimen, weighing nearly 300 pounds. The python is not poisonous, but I was picking his tiny, sharp teeth out of my arm for the next couple of hours. My work didn't always take me into such unpleasant places as the mouths of snakes. The day I saw this gorgeous bird of paradise, one of the boys and I were out looking for trap sites. We wanted this bird, but we had nothing with which to catch him. All I had was a ball of twine, but that gave me an idea. While this gaudy fellow was sitting up there like the bird on Nellie's hat, I had the boy climb the tree with one end of the twine. Was quite curious about all the details of our work. The framework of our makeshift snare was formed by 3 sharpened slivers of bamboo, which were pushed into the spongy bark of the tree. I surveyed the job from the ground as a loop of twine, formed into a noose, was draped over the bamboo spines. Native blowguns have accounted for many thousands of these birds, for their plumage has great commercial value. And this specimen was a rare find for us, so we were anxious not to harm him. With a grasshopper as big as a hummingbird to bait our snare, all we had to do was wait till he stuck out his neck. While my fine feathered friend was making up his mind upstairs, the boy and I were busy building a cage to put him in. From the jungle around us, we gathered strips of rattan. It was a simple matter to weave them into a basket. When we'd finished, we had turned out a pretty good piece of craftsmanship. All we needed to complete it was the bird of paradise. He'd spotted that big juicy grasshopper all right, so I left the boy in charge of the snare. while I hid in the brush nearby. I was afraid the two of us might frighten him. It was quite a come down for the bird, but though he was a bit ruffled, he was otherwise unharmed. It was a great day for me, though, as we put him away in our basket cage. It just shows that you don't always need elaborate preparations or equipment to capture rare specimens. We had come out here with nothing but a ball of twine. Everything else we used, we found around us in the jungle. We had perhaps broken the first rule of the wilderness: be prepared. But we had lived up to the second: be resourceful. And now we were obeying the third: be gone. Rivers are often the only trails through the jungle that you don't have to cut out by hand. Usually when we wanted to get up into the backcountry in search of animals, we'd follow the hidden streams that run like arteries through the mysterious heart of Malaya. Pulling our raft through the shallow water, we could see signs of teeming animal life all around us. We headed in for shore as soon as we spotted a likely campsite. We had come up here to look for animals that didn't live in the vicinity of our main headquarters camp. We were particularly anxious to get some flying foxes. In this country, looked like their habitat. While the rest of the boys busied themselves in building our camp, Ollie and I went out to scout the territory. We passed the hollowed-out roots of a tree, and we heard a noise and decided to investigate. I could tell that we had discovered the lair of some animal that had gone off and left her cub. I didn't want to be interrupted by an outraged mother, so I kept my revolver handy. It was a tiny leopard cub, only a few weeks old. After we put him in the bag, we headed back for camp with our newfound prize. When our river camp was completed, we set out in earnest to locate those flying foxes. These creatures are really huge bats, night flyers, and great fruit eaters. They sleep during the day, so I knew that if we could locate a wild orchard in the jungle, we'd be able to catch as many as we wanted. We didn't have to go far to find them. The whole colony would sleep up in a big tree. They looked like a lot of dead leaves. I was going to catch them in a net, but they were too high up to reach, so we chopped some long bamboo poles. We apparently woke some of them up, for they blundered around in the air trying to get the sleep and the sun out of their eyes. As soon as we had poles the right length, I fastened them to the net. The big bats that were really awake were flying too high, so I figured our best chance was to startle the others and grab them before they could gather their wits. I knew that in broad daylight, they'd be sun-blind and easy prey for our net. We were all ready now. All I had to do was just wake them up. We only caught one that time, but he was ugly enough for 10. I never developed any affection for these evil-looking animals, and although I was commissioned to get them, I always felt they'd be much more at home in a graveyard than in the zoo. We had captured and caged about a dozen flying foxes before we returned to camp. When we got there, we found we'd been dispossessed by an army of land crabs. These repulsive creatures travel in huge droves and literally eat their way through the jungle. They had destroyed all the food we had in camp. We handled them carefully because their claws were as powerful as hedge snippers, and we could easily have lost a couple of fingers by being careless. We threw them into the river, where the swift current would carry them off downstream. They've been known to attack a wounded native, unable to get out of their way, and leave nothing but a skeleton in a few hours. So you can see why we didn't want to share our camp with them. There's more than one way to skin a cat, and more than one way to catch him, too. The cat I was after was a black leopard. I knew he was in the neighborhood, and I planned to catch him the same way that you'd catch a catfish, by fishing for him. I had 100 feet of strong manila rope for my fishing line. For my fishing pole, I'd picked out a towering beetle nut palm. It was nearly 75 feet high, and my boy had to be a regular monkey to run the tackle up to the top. We weren't actually fishing, but we were using the deep sea principle of rod and line to capture big game. The beetle nut palm is as flexible as fine steel, so we pulled the top down until the tree was bent almost double. Then we tied the line securely, but the slash of a knife would send that trunk whipping back up into the air, jerking our net off the ground, with that black leopard in it, if I guessed right. But we had to have some way of luring the animal into the center of the net. To catch a catfish, you've got to bait the hook. And to catch a cat, you've got to do about the same thing. So we baited our net with a live chicken. If that wouldn't get him, nothing would. As a rule, some camouflaging is necessary when you're trying to fool these big cats, and this case was no exception. We were going to spend the night in the nearby trees, watching and waiting to cut the rope the minute the leopard stepped into the net. The final checkup convinced us that everything was in order before we left. It was rather spooky up in that tree. At night in the jungle, there's a lot of weird noises. It seems to be inhabited by a whole new order of wildlife. The boy was on the alert, all right. That cat was as black as his own heart, and I was ready to shoot if he started climbing. Well, there's one black cat that won't cross anybody's path again. Most animals are like some humans. They just don't like people. Whenever we stayed too long in one place, many of them would move deeper into the jungle. But while we always kept our main camp, we often trekked miles into the brush to set up temporary quarters. Housing was never a problem when we were out on the trail. With a brush knife as our only carpenter's tool, we could carve a bamboo palace right out of the jungle in a few hours. For with all its hardships, the jungle can provide for those who take the trouble to understand it. Anyhow, it provided us with all the comforts of a modern home, including termites. There were no white men and very few natives in this part of the country, so I knew the place would be swarming with wild animal life. After conferring with local tribesmen about the trails, I prepared to set out with the boys to see what there was that we could bring back alive. We hadn't gone far before we saw the local welcome committee, the ward boss of the jungle. Only a few hundred yards away, I noticed his political rival, the crocodile. When these two hoodlums met, there was going to be trouble, and I wanted to see it. It looks as if Mr. Tiger has had enough. That crocodile's hide is as thick as boilerplate, but the hide on Buck and Ollie wasn't, so we continued our inspection tour. It's bad enough to step on one of these babies, but to have one fall on you is very unpleasant. And I'd have walked right under him if Ollie hadn't warned me. He was a beauty, and we decided to go back to camp and get the boys so we could capture him. But when we got back, we found the python was making his way to a small stream. There was homicide in his heart, and the crocodile in the stream. That python was using his head, and 20-odd feet of body, too. The crocodile was too tough for the python to crush, but the powerful reptile was certainly giving him a pain in the neck. I had been commissioned to capture some of these rare spectacle monkeys. They're odd little fellows with their strange Eddie-Cantor eyes, but we had to travel a long way to the province of Pahang to reach their habitat. A monkey isn't nearly as clever as he thinks he is. It's a well-known fact that if he reaches into a small opening and gets a fistful of food, it never occurs to him to let go of the food so that he can pull out his open hand. So we hollowed out some coconuts to try to outsmart these rare monks. We staked out a lot of these hollow coconuts. To a small hole in one end, we poured a handful of rice. Here was a box lunch, served and ready to eat. Boy, was he frantic. If he didn't open his fist, he couldn't get away. If he opened his fist, he'd lose the rice. While he was still trying to figure out the combination to that coconut, we went out to get him. All in all, we caught about 15 of these spectacle monkeys with the old fist trick, and they all resented it just as much as this fellow. I've captured a lot of animals by letting them trap themselves. but these were the first that ever caught themselves and then wouldn't let go. The jungle sometimes reminded me of a theater. There was never a lack of actors or the continuous drama of wildlife that went on all around me. My business of bringing them back alive often gave me a front seat in these exciting performances, but I never really enjoyed them. Animals like the python and the tiger were typical of the code of fang and claw. They ruled wherever they roamed, and big as it was, the jungle wasn't big enough to hold them both. If these two jungle dictators were going to meet and discuss their territorial rights, Ollie and I wanted to be strictly neutral, and we had a 30-30 rifle to reinforce our neutrality. It looked to me as if the tiger had the best of it so far, and he seemed to be determined to follow up his advantage. But that python is not finished yet. The python tried to toss another coil over the big cat and lost his grip and his victim. I guess the tiger felt that he needed a drink after that, and he wasn't the only one. My Malay boys were hardworking and industrious most of the time, but whenever I left camp for a long period, something was sure to happen. One of the boys had carelessly forgotten to lock the door on the honey bear's cage, and he'd gotten away. The boys were certainly excited, and well they might be. Here was my honey bear cub, running off into the jungle. Even though he'd been born there, he'd only lived in the jungle a few months. It was as strange and as dangerous for him as it would have been for a Pekingese puppy. Talk about fool's luck. That little cub walked right over a sleeping python, and neither of them batted an eye. The bear was more worried about the posse that was after him, so he doubled back on his tracks to throw them off. The boys were horrified to see him go right over that python again. Only this time, the python wasn't asleep. He got away all right, but the boys didn't wait to see what happened. They thought he sure was a goner. Those Malay boys were really blue. And of course they knew I'd be furious because of their carelessness in letting the honey bear escape. But the little fellow had enough of the jungle and decided the eats were more regular in camp. That cub should have gotten a spanking, but I just turned him over to his friends for a once-over lightly. The armor-plated Indian rhinoceros, like something out of a prehistoric panzer division. I'd traveled way up to northern India to get one of these rhinos, and this one looked like a perfect specimen. He was a calf, not more than 3 years old. He may have been a baby, but in that family, babies are tough. So I took plenty of time observing him and planning how I'd capture him. For weeks, I'd kept the boys busy weaving a net to catch the rhino. It was the biggest net I'd ever used. It weighed over 1,000 pounds, and we'd practiced our strategy many times before taking it into the field. Our plan was to bring the net up facing him and send a line of boys around behind him to drive him toward us. We figured that to avoid the boys, he'd run between them and right into the net. But we figured wrong. He became so panic-stricken that he worked himself into a frenzy of rage. He charged the boys instead, and they got rattled and dropped the net. The net was made of coconut fiber, almost as tough as steel cable, but he tore it to shreds as if it were merely a spider web. He was mad clean through, ready to kill anybody who got in his way. If I hadn't pulled that toreador act that time, he'd have gotten me. We weren't going to let the rhino get away that easily. We followed his frenzied trail for miles until one of the boys found him. In his panic, he'd fallen into an abandoned native well. When I got there, I could see that he'd never get out by himself. I tossed a rope over him and we got ready to pull him out. Playing tug-of-war with a rhino is like trying to dry dock a battleship with 10 men in a tow rope. He may have been just a baby rhino, but he weighed exactly 1 ton, and his idea of cooperation was just to relax. Anyway, we got him out. Putting him into the cage was only a minor problem. But getting that cage back to camp was really a job. One day, the owner of a nearby rubber plantation made me a gift of a fine, fat pig. He was a walking pork tenderloin. I had to take care of him myself because my Malay boys were all Mohammedan, and their religion forbids them to even look at a pig. So it seemed that I'd have him all to myself. At least it did, until the morning when I found a python had crawled right into our camp during the night. He got through the slats of the pen easily enough, but when he'd swallowed the pig, he didn't have the same slim figure and couldn't get out. Python can swallow objects 4 times the size of his own head by simply unhinging his jaws. It took this fellow about 10 days to fully digest that pig. I'm sure he didn't enjoy it as much as I should have done, but it was a fair trade. I'd rather have a python any day than a pork chop. To bag the biggest game in Asia, I had to travel over 1,000 miles. I'd cross the Bay of Bengal to the island of Ceylon to locate and capture wild elephants. From a high bluff overlooking the river, I spotted a fine herd of Ceylon elephants. They were just what I wanted. I stayed around to spot their leader and to make a complete check on the number of animals in the group. It's a big job to capture elephants and requires a lot of planning. You can't catch an eagle in a butterfly net, and you can't keep elephants in a chicken coop. So I had 1,000 coolies felling timber to build a corral right out in the heart of the jungle. It takes elephants to catch elephants, and big fellows like this did most of the heavy work. Docile and obedient, the trained work elephant is a combination of derrick, tractor, and truck. While this big bull went through the forest like a squadron of tanks, a whole corps of natives were digging holes to receive the tree trunks that would go to make up our fence. This elephant lifted and set one of these heavy logs in a few seconds, an operation that took 20 men half an hour to do. The carving on this log was duplicated at regular intervals along the stockade. It was a native charm invoking divine protection against being trampled to death by elephants on the next day's drive. Our corral was almost finished. Around 4 acres of jungle, we had a fence of green logs. They were sunk deep in the earth and woven together with rope as tough as rawhide. We felt certain that no elephant could break his way through. But just to make sure, we had one of the work bulls tested. The next day, we located the herd, and we'd march out for capture. It was a simple matter to startle them into a stampede. With the help of 1,000 coolies, we herded them into the stockade like terrified sheep, and then barred the entrance, the only weak spot in the entire corral. To further protect it, the natives built huge bonfires beside the gate. We had captured the whole herd. Next morning, after the elephants had quieted down, we prepared to cut out the ones that were best suited for domesticating. The others would later be released and allowed to return to their native jungle. To keep the captives from getting panicky, most of the work was done with decoy elephants. The decoys were wise old tuskers, and they drove the rest of the herd away from the animal that we wanted. He had been tied to a tree to keep him from running back to the herd, while the tame elephants kept him from getting too frisky. As soon as he'd calmed down, he was put under a corporal's guard of decoys. They led him on a straight path out of the corral. I knew he'd given in, for his trunk was coiled up like a fire hose, an elephant's symbol of defeat. We followed this same method of selection and capture until we had completely filled all my orders. Back in camp, our little honey bear was taking a few lessons in the art of self-defense. That camp was like a circus. There was something going on constantly in all three rings. It was all very well for the animals to play, but we had work to do. There was a boat sailing out of Singapore in a few weeks, and we had to prepare our animals for shipment to America. Only the pelican seemed to object to the idea. It would have been almost as easy to go out and get another pelican as it was to get this fellow into his basket. was no simple matter getting our hundreds of animals ready for shipment. Each one was a problem in itself, which had to be solved separately. I did as much as I could myself, but I couldn't watch over all the animals. So I depended upon the boys to tend to some of the details, such as to make sure that all traveling crates were well sealed. The python was closing in on the honey bear when I rushed out, yelling for Ollie and the boys. Ollie ran up with a shotgun, but I knocked it out of his hand. A dead python is no good to a zoo, so I determined to get this one back in the crate alive. It was a tough battle. That big snake had tasted just enough freedom to want more. Trying to coil 20-odd feet of fighting python into a box is something you only want to do once. This was the second time I'd created this fellow, and I was afraid it was getting to be habit-forming. Things calmed down after that excitement, but the best way to keep an animal contented is to give his jaws something to do. They had a long journey ahead of them, and I wanted them to be comfortable as possible. Sometimes I end up with more animals than I've captured. Just as we were about to break camp, my pet mouse deer presented the expedition with a youngster. This little fawn weighed less than a pound and stood only 4 inches high. Gentleness and trust are rare in the jungle. So of all the animals I had, I think he was my favorite. I let the honey bear finish his last tussle with his sparring partner. I had accumulated enough animals to populate a couple of zoos, so it was time now to take the long trail to Singapore. When we were finally ready to leave the jungle, we loaded all of our animals onto bullock carts. This was a strange caravan. Each wagon was a Noah's Ark on wheels. It seemed almost as though the entire jungle had turned gypsy. After going for miles through the jungle, we changed to motor lorries and drove on to Singapore docks like a regular circus parade. Then it was time to stow aboard my wild cargo. And what strange cargoes they were. Every creature that ever walked, wiggled, or winged its way through the Asiatic jungle would end up, sooner or later, on my passenger list. It often took me from noon till midnight to get all the animals on the deck. And I used to wonder if old Noah had as much trouble loading his ark as I did mine. But I brought more to those boats than just animals. I brought all the hard work, the fun and the danger that went into capturing them. The unforgettable days and nights that I'd spent in the jungle to bring them back alive. Wherever you are, there's always a tide to take you home. But you never really say goodbye to the tropics. It's always, I'll be seeing you. But behind eastern clouds is a constant promise of adventure that pulls you back like a magnet. But I knew that the jungle would still be there whenever I came back. And all the wild animals would be there too, waiting again for me to take the long trail that stretches ahead of the jungle cavalcade.